Hi everyone, Dr. Garcia. I'm back here. This is the slide we left off before for video one, and I just kind of wanted to review this for a moment. So it's really important that we think about our own biases. What are your biases? Do you have any? It's really important for us to start our clinical training very early on, even as undergraduate students that are in a clinical and counseling psychology class. It's important to start really building the foundations of cultural competency in the world of clinical psychology. Now, another area that we need to focus on here is the knowledge of diverse cultures. It's very important for psychologists to acknowledge that their cultural difference exists within their clients. So perhaps you might be working with a Latino population. Well, guess what? There are inherent differences within that population. Or maybe you're working with a Black American population and an Asian American population. We need to know that we cannot apply the same ideas and beliefs exist for every single member of that particular group. We have to acknowledge that there are inherent differences, and not only acknowledge the inherent differences, but really even appreciate them. Appreciate the heterogeneity. In other words, appreciate the differences that exist within every culture. And really thinking about making these efforts in learning and really to understand that we cannot categorize groups of people as all being the same, because if we do, we're going to start stereotyping. So by recognizing the heterogeneity or the differences that exist within different groups, we will avoid stereotyping. And that's what's really important when we want to build a therapeutic alliance and build cultural competency. Now, it's also important for psychologists and clinical psychologists to understand that these differences, particularly for those with immigration status, doesn't necessarily mean for all, but there are different subgroups that definitely have acculturation strategies. And there's 4 different acculturation strategies. This is by Barry's model, a little bit of work by Gene Finney's model as well. So Barry and Finney had collaborated and worked together. They were some of the earlier researchers in the early 90s that were looking at acculturation strategies and acculturative stress. Gene Finney, by the way, was the one who developed our original multicultural lab that you might see on the 3rd floor in the psychology department. She was a professor at Cal State LA in our department and was doing some groundbreaking research in the early 90s when it came to multicultural issues and acculturation. And so the 4 acculturation strategies, right, this is why there might be these inherent differences. There's some people within a cultural group that agree with segregation. If you're segregating, you feel segregated and you align yourself to the cultural norms and beliefs of your culture of heritage, your heritage culture, and you feel segregated maybe from the dominant culture, and you're not really practicing an integration of the two. You really are just sort of feeling segregated from the dominant culture, and you're focusing on the beliefs, ideals, and practices that exist within your own culture of heritage. Now, integration is when an individual kind of is able to combine and implement practices, beliefs that are incorporated from both their heritage of culture, their culture of heritage, as well as the dominant culture. Then we have assimilation practices. Assimilation practices are when the person completely denounces their heritage and maybe even denounces cultural practices and beliefs to adopt the dominant culture's belief systems and customs and expectations. So assimilation is really somewhat of a rejection of the culture of your heritage and really only adopting the practices that are part of the dominant culture. That's a framework of assimilation, right? And then another acculturative strategy is marginalization. Marginalization is when people don't really feel like they are connected with their culture of heritage. They don't really feel connected to those practices, belief systems, and ideologies. Yet at the same time, they're also not really feeling connected with the practices and expectations and norms within the dominant culture as well. So they feel marginalized because they don't feel a sense of where they belong culturally. So this is why we need to look at these acculturative strategies, right? Segregation, integration, assimilation, and marginalization, because it helps clinical psychologists to understand there's a lot of inherent differences within cultures, and these inherent differences are going to be seen, present differently from person to person, even within the same group. So let's go ahead and move on from here. Microaggressions. Microaggressions are very important to talk about because these are everyday verbal and nonverbal slights. When a person experiences microaggressions on a daily basis, this can lead to chronic stress, race-based chronic stress. Race-based chronic stress can actually lead to race-based trauma. Most of these microaggressions do tend to center on ethnicity or race, but they can involve any number of differences between people. Ageism, gender minorities, those with a SES minority status, religion, sexual minorities as well. So really, when we look at the review of the literature in microaggressions, we do find that they cause significant distress and do contribute to serious psychological problems, and your mental health can be compromised. Now, we do know that these microaggressions are usually in intentional efforts to sort of dominate, to show the dominance of one group over another. There's a lot of research that's looking, is this a non-conscious bias, is this conscious and intentional? And there's enough research to tell us that, those that are engaging in these microaggressions, sometimes it's not about ignorance or unknown, but it is about making a statement that sort of tends to elevate their dominance and superiority over other people. So unfortunately, clinical psychologists are not immune from committing microaggressions against their own clients. And again, these microaggressions can certainly cause damage to the therapeutic alliance and the relationship that you're trying to foster and build with your mental health consumers. So cultural competence of clinical skills is very, very important. So we need to make cultural adaptations of treatment for diverse groups. We need to think about what treatment practices are we offering? Have they been normed against a particular cultural group? And if they're not, then perhaps we need to make adaptations to these therapies by showing what can happen when such adaptations don't happen. And we see the research for that. If we're not making the adaptations, we're not having effective outcomes. So that treatment intervention you just employed, if you haven't adopted it for that particular group, you're not going to have a therapeutic outcome that you're looking for. It's going to be costly. It's going to take time. You're going to lose the benefits. The individual's not going to have the quality of life they want. They may have impaired functioning. It's also financial costs for the consumer as well. So we have to take into consideration the risks and the costs of not adapting treatments for a diverse group. We really need to focus on customized therapies. So this will give us an opportunity to really think about specific cultural populations and maybe experiences that they have. For example, let me give you one example of research. There was a technique that was produced with positive therapy for many clients struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder. And so when it was adapted, this particular positive therapy of PTSD, when it was adapted for Chinese American women, they did well. However, when they used sort of business as usual practices of this positive therapy, the outcomes for Chinese American women unexpectedly worsened their symptoms because the framework of that positive therapy was not aligned with the cultural values and expectations. So the cultural adaptations are so important. We know that there's a lot of evidence-based therapies that produce positive outcomes. However, we have to be careful. Just because we read it and say, this is a great intervention, it's going to work, everyone does really well. That's not true for certain groups, because if it doesn't align with their cultural values, we would think that the intervention would help them improve, but actually there's been research to show that if we don't make these adaptations, then people's symptoms can worsen because we're applying the wrong therapeutic approach for that particular population. Very important. We need to make these adaptations and changes. There's another study there relating to language, so I want to make sure that you look at that as well. Again, people that were interviewed in their first language or in their mother tongue reported a higher number of severity of symptoms than if they were working in their secondary acquired language. So this helps us to know diagnoses as well, right? We may have inaccurate diagnoses and have misdiagnoses or underdiagnoses if we're not having language competency. All right, so there's a couple of different perspectives in the world of psychology. Just going over this very quickly, there's the etic perspective and the emic perspective. The etic perspective really comes from the fact that there's emphasis on similarities between people, and this was the dominant, sort of very dominant during the early days of psychology. And if you've taken our history and systems class, you'll know the problematic issues with taking on an etic perspective, right? And so historically, really, we have found that looking at people from the framework of universality has not benefited individuals in American psychology, and it has not benefited psychology overall as a discipline. The emic perspective emphasizes cultural specific norms and really stresses that there's different culture groups that have to be understood on their own terms, that there is not universality at all, like in our early days of psychology. But what's really dominating today is really trying to apply these practices of multiculturalism and these cultural specific identities and norms that are very different. Now, we have to be careful for that because now we're saying cultural specific norms. But again, we just talked about the heterogeneity within different cultural groups as well. So we sort of still have to find an appropriate balance of saying this is an emic perspective, but we know that there's still differences within these cultural norms as well. So what constitutes a culture? There's different ways of looking at that. We have a narrow versus broad definitions. A narrow definition could be ethnicity and race. A broad definition could be like an ethnographic or affiliation identities, and there's research that's done on that. We also can talk about culture from the framework of like subgroups or subcultures, sort of a lifestyle that's a unique norm that has its own expectations and values. An example for a subculture is maybe prison culture. People that are living in prison or that have spent some time in jail, they have their own subculture with its own expectations and norms and values and how your identity gets built there as well. Interacting cultural variables, we need to understand there's many cultural variables. We cannot try to describe culture with just one term or a few terms in languages, that there's a lot of different variables when we talk about culture. And then there's this interesting that they interact in many different ways. So there's this interesting confluence of many variables that have these interesting interactions that really shapes the experiences of our clients. So it's not just a linear perspective or a categorical perspective that this is a cultural variable A, cultural variable B, and cultural variable C. Now, that might be existence, but they have this interesting interaction that what emerges is this interesting life that the client experiences, and it shapes who they are. Training psychologists in cultural diversity is so important. So looking at the research of the training, we haven't figured out a really single best method or even a consensus for training as of yet, even though the world of psychology has been attempting to discuss cultural diversity at least, the last 30 years, but really the last 2 decades, having a stronghold, multiculturalism having a very strong hold in the world of psychology. Still, we need to really get deeper to appreciation of our own cultural identity, really need to get deeper in understanding the critical elements for multiculturally infused curriculum. We're still building this in our own classrooms. We're building it even in clinical training at the graduate level. So even though there's things that we know that we should be doing, like discussions, presentations, self-guided assignments, discussions with maybe your own family of origin, respect, curiosity, and humility, right? Humility is important, right? Because that helps us, if you're more humble and understanding that your perspective is different than others, that's linked to a much stronger relationship between you and your mental health consumer. The problem is we have identified some elements for multiculturally infused psychology curriculum, but we still there is no real strong consensus for training as of yet. So training psychologists in issues of diversity and culture has been problematic. One of the reasons why it's problematic is because measuring the outcomes reliably is difficult. Even knowing what the baseline is, what is the person's baseline sort of cultural competency? We don't have a good measure to assess baseline cultural competency, then do an intervention, and then have an outcome competency as well. So we have to establish the baseline for a level of competence before the training. Even if we have some assessments and measures and do that, we're not implementing them in the way that we do. We have to make causal connections between our efforts and our outcomes. In other words, there's a gap between what we're learning clinically in the world of clinical psychology and understanding about culture and diversity versus what's actually implemented in practice. So even though psychologists might be trained in these areas, there is a gap between what they're learning in professional development versus what they're actually putting into practice and implementing from a perspective of culture diversity. Okay, moving right along, we know that there have been some research studies that looked at the treatment outcome of culture-based interventions. And what these researchers found, it's Munoz and Mendelsohn from 2005. They actually provided one of the first reports of a study that was attempting to establish empirical evidence for a treatment with a specific minority population. So this was really important. In 2005, it wasn't that long ago that we kind of finally had one of the first research studies really looking at therapeutic approaches and outcomes. And what these researchers found is that, number one, we need to have much better improvements in clinical and research psychology, right? We need to really improve in what we're doing. But not only that, again, going back to those tailored programs, we have to not only develop but also evaluate prevention and treatment manualized therapy that are very specific to different cultural groups as well. These culture-specific manuals, though, help to inform core therapeutic strategies that really build a cultural competency within it. So there's culture-specific manuals that already have cultural competency in built in, which is really important because we already know clinical psychologists could be trained in cultural competency, but we know there's a gap between what they're learning and what they're implementing. So if they use manualized therapies that are culture-specific, then that reduces that gap that could be happening as well. We know that psychological interventions and strategies could then therefore be used in a culturally competent way.